My name is Tori Fairfax. I'm 34, and 3 weeks ago, my parents sold our family home in Portland for $1.8 million and handed every dollar to my sister, like I was never part of it. The same house I poured $200,000 into at 22, money my grandmother left specifically for my future. When I asked where my share was, my mom said, "Be happy for your sister's fresh start." They thought it was over until I pulled out one page of paperwork they forgot existed. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments, and I will give you a heart. I'm telling you this from Portland, Oregon, where the rain can be gentle and the people can be colder than the weather when money shows up. 3 weeks ago, my parents sold the house I grew up in for $1.8 million and handed every single dollar to my sister Meredith, like I was a stranger who wandered into the story halfway through. Not, "We'll split it later," not, "We'll talk about it," not even a fake apology with a hug and a cupcake. Just a phone call, a cheerful voice, and then the sentence that rewired my brain. Be happy for your sister's new start. If you've ever been the responsible one, you already know how this plays out. They train you like a well-behaved dog. You don't bark. You don't bite. You do what you're told. You understand. You always understand. That's what they call you when they're taking something from you. The understanding one. The strong one. The one who doesn't need anything. And that's exactly how my family wrote me into their script. Growing up, I wasn't the loud child. I wasn't the dramatic child. I wasn't the golden child. I was the reliable one. The one who got good grades, who didn't get pregnant, who didn't wreck a car, who didn't call at 2 a.m. from a stranger's couch saying life is unfair. I was the kid you could leave alone with a problem and come back later to find it solved. And the part nobody warns you about is this. In dysfunctional families, reliability doesn't earn respect. It earns entitlement. People start treating your competence like it belongs to them. Meredith is 4 years older than me. She's not evil, not cartoon villain evil. She's just practiced. Practiced at being the crisis. Practiced at being the center. Practiced at turning "help me" into an identity. She struggled through school, bounced majors, dropped out twice, finally got a communications degree she never used. Married a car salesman named Kevin at 24. Had 2 kids. And somewhere between the wedding photos and the baby shower balloons, she became the one who needed help. In our family, need was currency. If you needed help, you got attention. If you didn't, you got ignored. I went the other direction. I graduated with honors in accounting, got hired at Morrison and Caldwell, worked my way up, got my CPA, built a quiet life I could afford. I rented a decent place in the Pearl District, paid my bills, kept my head down. And I thought stupidly that if I did life right, it would protect me. Like good choices were armor. They're not. They just make you look like the easiest person to exploit because you're the only one with anything to take. The pattern started small, so small you can't even call it betrayal at first. It's a request. Just this once. Temporary. Family helps family. Car trouble. A bill. A late fee. Then it becomes normal. My parents would call, and I'd hear that tone before the ask, the soft pre-guilt, the warm-up lap. "Tori, your sister is struggling." Like Meredith's struggles were weather, and I was the umbrella. In 2018, I gave Meredith $15,000, supposedly for couples therapy and a getaway to reconnect with Kevin. She promised she'd pay it back. I knew she wouldn't. I sent it anyway. At Thanksgiving that year, I mentioned it gently, just a sentence, not even an accusation. My mother pulled me aside, squeezed my elbow like she was guiding a toddler away from a tantrum, and hissed, "Don't be petty, Tori. Your sister is struggling. You have a good job." That's when it hit me for the first time. My mother didn't hear I lent money. She heard, I'm requesting recognition. And in her mind, I wasn't entitled to that. I was a resource. You don't thank the charger for charging your phone. You just plug in and expect it to work. Over 10 years, I tallied it once like an idiot because accountants don't stop being accountants just because it's family. Over $40,000 in loans that were really gifts, birthday gifts that were really bill payments, Christmas checks that went straight to credit card debt, help that would never come back. And that number still didn't include the big one, the $200,000, the money my grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell, left to me. My grandmother died in March 2012. She was 87, sharp to the end, and she loved me fiercely in that rare way some older women love the quiet granddaughter who shows up. I visited every Sunday during college. 40 minutes to Lake Oswego, Scrabble boards, old movies, the same stories about the Depression and her bakery and the smell of cinnamon in the mornings. Meredith visited twice a year, if that. Christmas and Eleanor's birthday. Sometimes not even that. So when the will was read and I got the money, nobody should have been surprised. But my mother acted like somebody slapped her in public. The lawyer read it clean. To my granddaughter, Tori in Fairfax, I leave the sum of $200,000 so that she may have a solid financial foundation for her future. My mother's face tightened. Meredith got china. Mom got jewelry. Dad got the grandfather clock. But I got the money, the actual life-changing piece. And at the funeral reception, my mother leaned in close and said, low and venomous, "You must have manipulated her." Manipulated, like I put a spell on an 87-year-old woman by visiting her. That moment should have told me everything about the kind of mind I was dealing with. But at 22, I still believed in the family myth. That blood equals safety. That parents don't betray their children. 2 months later, my mother called with what she called a wonderful opportunity. I still hear her voice now, too bright, too confident, like she'd practiced it in the mirror. "Tori, you can invest in the family's future." The pitch was simple. The family house, bought in 1995, had around $120,000 left on the mortgage, worth about $500,000 at the time. If I contributed my $200,000, it would pay off the mortgage and fund renovations, and in exchange, I'd own 40% of the home's value when it eventually sold. "Think of it like an investment," my father said, playing supportive husband to my mother's script. "Real estate always appreciates." My mother added the killer line, the one that should be illegal because it weaponizes the dead. It's what Grandma Eleanor would have wanted. I hesitated because $200,000 was my entire safety net, my entire foundation. My mother's eyes hardened instantly. "Don't you trust us, Tori?" The way she said it made trust feel like a test, not a relationship. That night, I called my best friend Claire, and bless her, she didn't care about family optics. She cared about my survival. "Get something in writing," she said. "Anything. A napkin. A text. Something." I asked my parents for a written agreement, and my mother laughed like I'd asked her to sign over a kidney. "Fine," she said, rolling her eyes, "if you want to be professional about it." My father typed up a simple one-page agreement on his home computer. It stated I, Tori Fairfax, was contributing $200,000 to the family home, representing 40% of its value, to be repaid upon sale or transfer of the property. Both my parents signed it, dated August 15th, 2012. I kept the original in a safety deposit box at Wells Fargo. It cost $75 a year. Best $75 I ever spent. Then life happened the way it does when you think you're building something stable. I worked. I advanced. I got my CPA. I built retirement accounts. I did boring, responsible adult things. Meredith did chaotic things. She had Emma in 2016 and Jacob in 2019. She never went back to work. "The kids need me," she'd say, which sounded noble until you watched how often she used it as a shield against any consequence. Kevin's income covered the basics, barely, and my parents kept calling. Roof repairs, HVAC, property taxes. "Can you chip in? It's an investment. It's for the house you have a share in." I sent money, more money, because I believed the lie that my compliance was love. Over 12 years, I sent another $35,000 toward repairs and taxes. No new paperwork, just bank transfers and memo lines like roof repair and family help. Because part of me still wanted to believe my parents would do the right thing when it mattered. That's the trap right there. People like my mother survive on your belief in when it matters. They push the line slowly, and by the time you realize it matters, you've already given them everything they wanted. In January 2024, Meredith's marriage finally collapsed. Kevin left her for a woman he met at the dealership. He kept the house because it was in his name. Meredith moved back in with my parents with 2 kids and a tornado of sadness and entitlement. And suddenly every family conversation centered on one thing. How do we help Meredith start over? Not, how do we help Meredith grow up? Not, how do we help Meredith rebuild responsibly? Just, how do we give her a new life? Because in my family, Meredith wasn't expected to build. She was expected to be rescued. Then came October 15th, 2024. I remember the date because I was at my desk reviewing quarterly statements when my mother called, voice practically singing. "Wonderful news," she said. "We sold the house. $1.8 million. Can you believe it? The Portland market is insane right now." My brain did the math before my heart could catch up. 40% of $1.8 million is $720,000. My original investment plus 12 years of appreciation. My grandmother's foundation finally doing what it was supposed to do. Finally, I started to say, "That's great, Mom. So when do I?" And she cut in like a blade. "We've decided to give it all to Meredith." I didn't breathe. I just sat there listening to her continue, cheerful and oblivious like she'd just announced a vacation. She needs it more than anyone. Poor thing lost everything in the divorce. She needs a down payment, money to get back on her feet. This will give her a fresh start. I whispered, "Mom, what about my share?" There was a pause, then her voice turned cold, dismissive, final. "That was your contribution to the family, Tori. You've done well for yourself. You have a career. Meredith has nothing." I said, "We had an agreement. Dad typed it. You both signed it." And do you know what my mother did? She laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not uncomfortable laughter. She laughed like I'd made a joke. "That was just family paperwork," she said. "Nobody's going to hold you to that. We're family, not business partners." And then the line that still makes my stomach twist. "Be happy for your sister." She hung up. I sat at my desk for 10 minutes without moving. My computer screen went to sleep. People walked past my office and smiled and talked about weekend plans while my entire understanding of my family cracked like a plate dropped on tile. That night I didn't sleep. I replayed everything like surveillance footage. The $15,000. The Thanksgiving, don't be petty. The you have the ability. The it's what Grandma would have wanted. My mother turning my grandmother's gift into a family asset to redistribute like I was a bank account with legs. At 6 a.m., I called Claire. She answered half asleep, and when I told her, she woke up fast, like rage is caffeine. "Please tell me you kept that agreement," she said. I did. Of course I did. I'm an accountant. I keep everything. "Then you need a lawyer," she said. "Today." "Not tomorrow. Today." I checked the email my mother had forwarded weeks earlier when she still thought I was going to smile and clap. Closing was scheduled for October 20th. 5 days. My hands were shaking as I said, "I don't know if I can do this. They're my family." And Claire said the sentence that finally shoved my brain into the light. What family takes $200,000 from their daughter and then acts like it never happened? That afternoon I sat in a downtown high-rise office across from a real estate attorney named Nathan Webb. Calm eyes, silver at the temples, the kind of man who's seen every version of Betrayal and still manages to sound bored by it. I handed him 3 things: the 2012 agreement, the wire transfer record, and my grandmother's will. He read them twice in silence. Then he set the papers down and said, "Ms. Fairfax, under Oregon law, this agreement is binding." I felt my lungs work again. He explained my options. A formal demand letter could take months. But if I showed up at the closing with documents, I could force the sale to stop on the spot because no escrow officer can close a deal with a legitimate ownership dispute. He looked at me and said, "Your family will try to manipulate you. The question is whether you'll hold firm." And here's the honest thought I had, the ugly thought people don't say out loud. I wasn't scared of losing my family. I was scared of becoming the villain in their story. Because my mother has always been good at stories. She makes herself the saint, Meredith the victim, and me the cold-hearted accountant who put money over love. I sat there and realized something sickening. I had been living my whole life according to the fear of a narrative, not reality, a story they'd tell about me. And that's when I said, quietly, "I'll hold firm." Nathan drafted a notice to the real estate company. Ownership dispute. Legal notice. No name disclosed yet. Just enough to freeze the ground under my parents' feet. Then he leaned forward and dropped the detail that made my stomach turn. "I reviewed the seller's disclosure your parents filed. They stated there are no ownership claims or disputes on the property," meaning they didn't just forget. Maybe they did, but they also signed paperwork that erased me. And you don't accidentally erase a $200,000 contribution with a signed agreement. You erase it because you're counting on the person you're erasing to stay quiet. On October 17th at 5:47 p.m., my mother called in a bright, fake voice like she was hosting a morning show. "We're having a celebration after the closing," she said. "A housewarming party for Meredith. You'll come, won't you? The whole family will be there." I said, "I'll try." And after we hung up, I sat alone in my apartment feeling a colder kind of anger settle into my bones. The kind that doesn't scream, it calculates. Then a text came from Meredith. "Thanks for understanding. You've always been the strong one. Love you." And I stared at it and thought, does she even know what she's thanking me for? Does she know she's about to toast champagne with the money my grandmother left for me? I couldn't tell yet, but I was going to find out. Because 2 days before the closing, I went back to my parents' house under the excuse of picking up old photo albums. And my mother wasn't home, my father was out, and Meredith was there with the kids. And as I stood in my childhood bedroom sorting pictures, I heard her voice through the thin wall, laughing into her phone, saying the words that made everything inside me go quiet and sharp at the same time. "No, Tori won't make trouble. She's too nice for that. You know how she is." Then she said, casual as breathing, "Mom said she put in some money years ago, but that was forever ago. Ancient history. And honestly, I need this more. I have the kids. What does Tori have to spend money on? Her apartment. Her boring accounting job." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there listening as my sister, the one who was about to get my grandmother's gift, explained to someone how my entire life could be reduced to boring, while she justified taking what wasn't hers. And right then, I understood the real betrayal wasn't just my parents deciding I didn't deserve my money. It was realizing my sister had already decided it too, and they were all counting on the same thing. That I would understand, that I would swallow it, that I would keep the peace, that I would be the good daughter even while they robbed me with a smile. I left without the photo albums. I walked to my car like a ghost. And in the driver's seat, hands shaking on the steering wheel, I opened my phone, stared at the calendar, and realized the closing was in 48 hours. My lawyer had already put the real estate company on notice. And my family had absolutely no idea that the understanding one had finally run out of understanding. I didn't sleep the night after hearing Meredith's voice through the wall, because once you hear someone explain your worth, like a footnote, your body doesn't rest anymore. It stays alert, like it's finally caught the predator it's been sensing for years. I drove home in silence, no music, no podcasts, just the sound of my own breathing and one thought looping in my head over and over. They all knew. Maybe not the exact number, maybe not every detail, but they knew enough to decide I didn't matter, enough to decide my money mattered more than I did. And that's the kind of realization that doesn't feel dramatic at first. It feels quiet, surgical, like something is being cleanly cut out of you without anesthesia. I called Claire at 1 in the morning, my voice flat, almost calm, which scared her more than if I'd been screaming. And when I told her what I'd heard, she didn't rush to comfort me. She didn't soften it. She said the sentence I needed. Then this isn't about misunderstanding anymore. Tori, this is about entitlement. And that word settled into me like a diagnosis. Entitlement. They felt entitled to my money, my silence, my compliance, my role as the one who absorbs discomfort, so everyone else can stay comfortable. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling until the sky started to lighten, and that's when another thought crept in, one that made my chest tighten. What if I back out now? What if I decide this is too much? What if I let them have it just to avoid the fallout? Because that's what I'd always done. And that thought scared me more than the idea of losing them, because it meant I would lose myself again, and I wasn't sure I could survive doing that one more time. The next morning, I met Nathan Webb again, this time not as a scared daughter, but as a client who finally understood the stakes. And he walked me through exactly what would happen at the closing, who would be there, how it would unfold, and the more he explained, the clearer something became. I wasn't causing chaos, I was interrupting it, because chaos had already been happening quietly for 12 years. I'd just been the only one paying for it. He told me the buyers were an older couple downsizing, cautious, detail-oriented, the kind of people who would immediately pull back if anything felt off, and I felt a strange flicker of relief knowing there would be witnesses, neutral adults who weren't emotionally invested in my family's mythology. We finalized the plan, and when I walked out of his office, Portland looked different to me. Not softer, not kinder, just sharper, like the world after you've made a decision you can't unmake. That afternoon, my mother called again, and this time I almost laughed at how perfectly her tone had shifted. The anger was gone, replaced with warmth, nostalgia, maternal concern. "Tori, honey, I've been thinking," she said, and I thought, here comes the pivot, the rewrite, the attempt to pull me back into the role she preferred. "I don't want money to come between us," she continued. And the hypocrisy of that sentence almost made me dizzy, because money hadn't come between us, money had been taken from me, quietly, confidently, with a smile. I didn't argue, I didn't explain, I just said, "We can talk after the closing," and there was a pause on the line that told me she felt something slipping that she didn't know how to grab back. The day before the closing, I laid out my clothes like armor, a navy blazer, white blouse, black slacks, nothing flashy, nothing apologetic. Exactly how I show up to client meetings at work, because this was a business meeting now, whether my parents liked it or not. That night, Meredith texted me again. Something about the kids being excited for their new rooms, about how grateful she was. And I stared at the screen thinking about how gratitude is easy when it costs you nothing. And I didn't respond, not because I was trying to punish her, but because I was done feeding the illusion that my silence meant consent. The morning of October 20th arrived too quickly. Gray and damp, the kind of Portland morning that presses down on you. And when I walked into Lakewood Realty with Nathan, 15 minutes early, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but my steps were steady because fear and resolve can coexist, and people don't talk about that enough. We were led into a glass-walled conference room where we could see everyone arriving. My parents first, my mother in pearls, my father tugging at his collar, laughing too loudly with the agent. Meredith next, polished, glowing, already talking about paint colors, and watching them from behind that glass felt like watching a play where you know the ending, but the actors don't yet. When Meredith finally noticed me, her confusion was genuine. "Tori," she said, and for a split second I saw the crack, the moment where reality tried to intrude, before my mother's eyes snapped to me, and something like fear flashed across her face, quick and sharp. "What are you doing here?" my father asked, and I said evenly, "I came to support the family," and introduce Nathan. And that was when the room shifted, because the word attorney changes air pressure. It turns casual into formal instantly. The agent cleared her throat, visibly nervous, and announced there was a matter to address before proceeding, an ownership dispute that had been filed. And my mother laughed, that brittle sound that always meant she was losing control. "That's ridiculous," she said. "This house belongs to us." And I said, quietly, "You know exactly what this is about." And the buyers looked at each other, alarmed, and Nathan stood, calm, professional, and laid the agreement on the table like a mirror no one wanted to look into. Watching my father pick it up, watching the color drain from his face, Watching him remember typing it, signing it, promising me something he later pretended never existed, was one of the strangest moments of my life, because it wasn't dramatic, it was sad, like watching someone realize too late that their silence has consequences. Meredith's mouth fell open when Nathan said the number, $720,000, and she looked at me like I'd pulled a weapon instead of a document. "You're suing us?" she asked, and I said, "I'm asking for what I was promised." And the buyer stood up almost immediately, uncomfortable, unwilling to be part of a family implosion. And when they left, the room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls were closing in on the truth. My mother leaned across the table, tears in her eyes, accusing me of choosing money over family. And for the first time in my life, I didn't absorb it, I reflected it back. "You chose to give my money away without telling me," I said, and the words felt heavy but clean, like a truth finally spoken out loud. Meredith cried, invoking her kids, invoking her pain, invoking everything except accountability. And I realized in that moment how often children are used as shields by adults who don't want to face consequences. And it hardened something in me, not against her kids, but against the manipulation. When Nathan said the sale would be paused, officially frozen, my mother looked like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. And as we walked out, her card lay untouched on the table, a symbol of everything she refused to accept. An hour later, the agent called me to confirm what I already knew. The sale was frozen. My parents were not handling it well. And as I hung up, I felt something unexpected, not triumph, not joy, but a deep, trembling calm, like I'd finally stopped running from a fire that had been chasing me my entire life. That evening, the guilt campaign began, calls, texts, warnings, threats to tell the family what kind of daughter I was, and for the first time, none of it worked, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it, and once you choose yourself, you can't go back to pretending you don't matter. Meredith called late that night, her voice stripped of theatrics, asking if I really put in $200,000, and when I said yes, and she admitted she'd known there was something, but didn't want to know how much, I felt the final thread snap, the last excuse fall away, and as I hung up, staring into the dark, I understood that whatever happened next, whatever fallout came, whatever relationships survived or didn't, there was no version of my life where I could go back to being the one who understands. While being erased, because the closing wasn't just about a house anymore, it was about whether I would finally be seen as a person or continue being treated like a resource. And the real reckoning hadn't even begun yet, because freezing the sale was just the opening move. And my family was about to realize that silence had been the only thing protecting them all these years, and it was gone. The days after the sale froze moved slower than anything I'd ever experienced, like time itself was waiting to see who would blink first. And for once it wasn't me. My phone became a battleground, lighting up with messages that swung wildly between accusation and affection, rage and nostalgia. And what struck me most wasn't the volume of it, but the choreography, because I'd seen this dance before, just never from this angle. My mother's texts came in waves, first sharp and punitive, then soft and wounded, then moral, invoking family values like scripture, then practical, asking if there was any way to compromise, as if compromise hadn't been the currency of my entire adult life. My father sent fewer messages, but each one carried the weight of avoidance, phrases like, "let's all calm down," and "this has gotten out of hand," as though the problem wasn't the theft, but the fact that I'd noticed it. Meredith oscillated between silence and sudden bursts of panic, sending voice notes where I could hear the kids in the background. Her voice cracking as she talked about how scared she was, how unstable everything felt, how she didn't know where they'd live if the buyers walked, and every time she said it I felt the old reflex kick in, that urge to fix, to rescue, to absorb the fear so everyone else could exhale, and every time it rose up, I had to consciously push it back down and remind myself that empathy does not require self-erasure. Nathan called to update me, his tone steady, factual, grounding, telling me the buyers had issued a formal ultimatum. 7 days to resolve the ownership dispute or they would withdraw entirely and demand their earnest money back. And when he explained what that would mean for my parents, financially and legally, I felt something close to vindication, but not quite, because it wasn't joy, it was inevitability. like gravity finally asserting itself after years of being ignored. That same afternoon, my mother hired her own lawyer, a family attorney whose name I recognized from years of watching him represent people like her. People who believed the world bent more easily when you spoke with confidence and indignation. And Nathan told me, almost amused, that her lawyer had advised her to settle quickly, that any judge would see the agreement as valid. And I imagined my mother hearing that, realizing for the first time that her version of events did not carry legal weight. And I wondered what that felt like for someone who had always controlled the narrative. The real turning point came when she decided to take the fight public, calling relatives, spinning stories, framing herself as the victim of an ungrateful daughter who cared more about money than blood. And if this were the old me, that would have worked, because the idea of being seen as greedy or cold terrified me more than losing anything tangible. But something had shifted, and instead of shrinking, I documented. I drafted a simple email, factual, restrained, attached the agreement, attached the bank records, explained the situation without adjectives or emotion, and sent it to the same relative she'd called. And then I sat back and waited, heart pounding, knowing this was a line I could never uncross. The responses came faster than I expected, some cautious, some shocked, some furious on my behalf. And the most jarring part was realizing how many people already knew what my mother was capable of, how many had their own stories of manipulation, of entitlement, of being quietly steamrolled and told it was love. Aunt Linda called me that evening and said without hesitation, "I believe you," and told me about a dispute over my grandmother's estate I'd never been told about, where my mother had tried to claim more than she was entitled to until lawyers were mentioned, and hearing that felt like discovering a hidden family medical history, suddenly explaining symptoms I'd lived with my whole life. Uncle Robert followed, blunt and unapologetic, telling me my father had asked him to talk sense into me, and he'd refused, saying the only sense missing was accountability, and with every call, every message, the story my mother was trying to sell lost credibility, because truth has a way of doing that when you back it up with paper. My father called 2 days later, alone, his voice small in a way I'd never heard before, and when he apologized, really apologized, not the vague kind, but the kind where he admitted he remembered signing the agreement, remembered knowing it mattered, remembered choosing silence because it was easier than confronting my mother. Something inside me cracked open, not in forgiveness, not yet, but in clarity, because for the first time he named the thing I'd always felt, that his inaction wasn't. Neutral, it was a choice, and that choice had shaped my life. He told me he would make sure I got my money, even if it meant standing up to her, and I wanted to believe him, desperately, but years of disappointment don't dissolve overnight. So I told him I needed more than words, and he said he understood, and we hung up in a silence that felt heavy but honest. The negotiation meeting was set for October 26th, and walking into that conference room felt nothing like the closing, because this time the stakes were explicit, the masks thinner, the posturing more desperate. My parents sat across from me with their attorney, Meredith absent at my request, because this wasn't about sibling rivalry, it was about broken contracts, and when their lawyer proposed the settlement, transferring $720,000 to me from the proceeds in exchange for a release, my chest tightened, because this was the moment where everything could still be undone if I wavered, if I softened, if I tried to make it easier for them. And instead, I added one condition, one thing I needed that wasn't. Financial, an acknowledgement out loud in front of witnesses that the money was always mine and that what they'd tried to do was wrong. My father said it immediately, voice shaking, eyes wet, but my mother stared at the table, jaw clenched, and for a long moment I thought she would refuse, that she would rather scorch the earth than admit fault, and when she finally said it, flat, resentful, "It was yours." It wasn't satisfying, but it was real, and sometimes that's all closure is, reality spoken without decoration. In the hallway afterward, she accused me of humiliating her, of winning, of keeping score, and I told her the truth, that I'd kept a document, not a vendetta, that I'd trusted her for 12 years to do the right thing, and she hadn't, and that if we were going to have any relationship moving forward, it would have to be equal, bounded, no more unspoken expectations, no more financial bleed disguised as love. And when she admitted she didn't know how to do that, I realized she might never learn. And that had to be okay. The closing happened without me, quietly, efficiently, and when the deposit hit my account 3 days later, $720,000 blinking on my screen. I didn't cry, I didn't cheer, I just sat there, breathing, feeling something lift that I hadn't even known was crushing me. Because relief doesn't announce itself. It just leaves space where tension used to live. I called Claire and told her it was done. And she said something that stuck with me, that closure isn't fireworks, it's quiet. And she was right, because the real aftermath wasn't dramatic, it was structural. I set aside money, invested, planned, did the boring, responsible things I'd always done. But this time with a sense of agency instead of obligation. And the first decision I made that felt truly mine was starting a small scholarship fund in my grandmother's name. Not as a gesture of spite or virtue, but because she believed in foundations and giving people a base to stand on. And it felt like honoring her in a way my family never had. Therapy followed, hard sessions where I had to confront the version of myself who believed love was transactional, that being good meant being useful, and learning that boundaries aren't punishments, they're definitions. My relationship with my family recalibrated into something unfamiliar, quieter, less enmeshed. My mother stopped asking for money. My father started showing up differently. Meredith surprised me by getting a job and buying a smaller house with her own funds. And we spoke cautiously, honestly, for the first time in years, acknowledging jealousy, resentment, fear, without pretending it hadn't existed. Sitting in my new condo months later, rain tapping against the windows, the city glowing softly outside, I framed the agreement and hung it on my wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that I was worth protecting even when the people who should have protected me didn't. And as I looked at it, I understood that the real inheritance wasn't the money, it was the moment I stopped disappearing to make others comfortable. Because the reckoning wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a different one. And the part no one was prepared for was what happens when the family scapegoat finally steps out of the role. Because when the person who's always absorbed the cost walks away, everyone else has to face what they've been avoiding. And that fallout, the reshaping of relationships, the quiet panic of people realizing the safety net is gone, was still unfolding. And I knew the next chapter would test everything I'd just learned. Because choosing yourself once is hard, but choosing yourself consistently, when the guilt resurfaces, when the old patterns try to pull you back in, that's where the Betrayal story continues. And that's where things were about to get even more complicated. The weeks after the money landed in my account felt deceptively calm, like the silence after an earthquake when everyone is standing still trying to figure out which buildings are actually safe. And it was in that quiet that I realized the hardest part wasn't the fight. It was the reprogramming, because for the first time in my life, there was no emergency to respond to, no crisis to manage, no sibling to rescue, no parent to placate. And without that constant pressure, my nervous system didn't know what to do with itself. I woke up every morning expecting my phone to be vibrating with demands or accusations. And when it didn't, I felt strangely untethered, like I'd been holding my breath for decades and now had to learn how to breathe normally. My mother's calls slowed to once a week, then once every 2 weeks, always polite, always superficial, conversations that felt like scripted small talk between coworkers rather than a mother and daughter. And while part of me grieved that loss, another part felt relief so sharp it almost hurt, because distance, it turns out, is a form of peace. My father tried harder, sending articles he thought I'd like, calling to ask about my work, even asking my opinion on things for the first time in my adult life. And every time he did, I noticed how unfamiliar it felt to be consulted instead of instructed. How sad it was that this version of him only emerged after everything had blown up, and how complicated forgiveness becomes when accountability arrives late. Meredith hovered at the edges of my life, cautious, tentative, no longer entitled, but not fully self-sufficient either. And our conversations were awkward in a new way, stripped of the old hierarchy, where she took and I gave, replaced with something uncertain where neither of us knew our roles yet. And I realized that when you stop enabling someone, they don't immediately become better. They become uncomfortable. And that discomfort is often mistaken for cruelty by the person who's finally saying no. Work changed too in subtle ways, because once you assert your worth in one arena, it becomes harder to tolerate being undervalued anywhere else. And I found myself speaking up in meetings, negotiating instead of accepting, noticing how often I'd previously deferred not because I agreed, but because it felt safer to be agreeable, and the raise I finally asked for felt less like a victory and more like a correction, like something that should have happened years ago if I'd believed then what I believe now. Therapy peeled back layers I didn't even know were there, sessions where I talked about money, but ended up crying about childhood, about the unspoken rules that govern my family, that Meredith's chaos made her fragile and therefore deserving, while my competence made me sturdy and therefore expendable. And my therapist named it plainly parentification, the quiet transfer of adult responsibility onto a child who learns early that love is conditional on usefulness. That word lodged in my chest because it reframed everything, the loans, the guilt, the way my mother praised me for being strong while simultaneously exploiting that strength. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it, couldn't pretend that what happened was a misunderstanding instead of pattern. The scholarship fund became my anchor during that time, paperwork and planning grounding me when emotions threatened to spiral, and every form I filled out felt like reclaiming a piece of my grandmother's intention, transforming something that had been used as leverage against me into something that could quietly empower someone else. And when the foundation was officially approved, when the confirmation email came through, I cried harder than I had over the money itself, because it felt like closing a loop my family had tried to break. Holidays arrived with a different energy, less explosive but more loaded. Thanksgiving a polite affair where no one mentioned the house or the money, where my mother complimented my cooking like she was afraid to criticize anything, and Meredith watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Maybe regret, maybe recalibration. And when I left early without explanation, no one tried to stop me, a small but telling shift, because for once my absence wasn't treated like a problem to solve. Christmas was quieter still, phone calls instead of gatherings, gifts mailed instead of exchanged in person, and while part of me missed the familiarity of chaos, another part recognized how much of that nostalgia was tied to pain, not joy, and how easy it is to romanticize survival once you're no longer in danger. Friends reacted in ways that surprised me, some applauding my resolve, others questioning whether it was worth it, whether money was worth family tension, and I learned quickly who understood boundaries and who benefited from me not having them, because the people who pushed back hardest were often the ones who expected me to be endlessly accommodating in their own lives too. One evening, months later, I ran into my mother unexpectedly at a grocery store near my old neighborhood, and the encounter was so mundane it almost felt surreal, standing in the produce aisle discussing avocados after everything that had happened. And when she asked hesitantly if I was happy now, I realized the question wasn't about me at all. It was about whether my choice had been justified by visible success, whether my independence had paid off enough to retroactively excuse her behavior. And I told her the truth, that happiness wasn't a switch flipped by money, but that peace had grown where anxiety used to live, and that peace mattered more to me than her approval. She nodded, unsatisfied, and we parted without resolution, and I felt a strange sense of acceptance settle in, because closure, I was learning, doesn't always come from agreement. Sometimes it comes from letting go of the need for one. Meredith reached out again in the spring, asking for advice about budgeting, about saving, about things she'd never bothered to learn when she could rely on my parents or me, and helping her felt different now, not obligatory, not sacrificial, but conditional, framed by clear limits. And when I said no to something she asked for, expecting backlash, she surprised me by accepting it, a small sign that growth, while slow, was possible. I started dating again, cautiously, noticing how my old patterns tried to resurface, the impulse to overgive, to prove my worth through effort, and catching myself before I disappeared into someone else's needs. And those moments felt like tiny victories, quiet corrections that no one else could see, but that mattered deeply to me. The framed agreement on my wall became less about the conflict it represented and more about the boundary it symbolized, a reminder that trust without accountability is just a gamble, and that even with family, especially with family, clarity is kindness. Sometimes late at night, I replayed the closing in my head, the look on my mother's face when the narrative slipped from her control, the realization that she couldn't talk her way out of paper and signatures, and instead of feeling satisfaction, I felt a sobering awareness of how easily things could have gone differently if I hadn't kept records, if I doubted myself, if I'd prioritized peace over justice yet again. That thought fueled a new kind of responsibility, not to my family, but to myself and to others like me, the reliable ones, the quiet ones, the ones who are expected to absorb losses because they can handle it. And I began sharing my story more openly, not for sympathy, but as a cautionary tale, watching people's expressions shift from disbelief to recognition as they realized how familiar it sounded. And just when it felt like the dust had settled, when routines had formed and boundaries felt sturdier, a new tension began to surface, subtle at first, then unmistakable, as my mother's tone changed again. Not angry, not guilty, but calculating, conversations drifting toward estate planning, toward what would happen one day. And I felt a chill run through me as I recognized the pattern trying to reassert itself in a new form. Because the hardest lesson of all was this: standing up for yourself once doesn't end the story, it just changes the stakes. And I knew, deep down, that the next test wouldn't be about money already lost or recovered, but about whether I would recognize manipulation even when it came disguised as reconciliation. Because the real reckoning wasn't finished yet, it was simply evolving, and the choices ahead would demand even more clarity, more resolve, and more willingness to disappoint people who had grown accustomed to my silence. The shift happened quietly at first, the way real danger usually does, not with raised voices or threats, but with softness, with concern, with language that sounded like healing and smelled like peace. And if I hadn't already lived through the last chapter, I might have missed it entirely, because my mother didn't come at me angry or demanding anymore. She came careful, thoughtful, almost gentle, asking how I was feeling these days, telling me she'd been doing a lot of reflecting, saying therapy had opened her eyes, a phrase that should have comforted me, but instead made something in my chest tighten, because reflection without accountability is often just strategy with better lighting. She started mentioning the future, not directly at first, just in passing, comments about how time goes so fast, how none of us are getting younger, how it's important for families to come together and plan responsibly. And I noticed how often those conversations drifted toward assets, toward what my parents had left, toward how complicated things could become if everything wasn't handled fairly, a word my mother loved to use when she meant equally, regardless of context or contribution. I listened without reacting, a skill I'd perfected over decades, and I let her talk, because when people think you're calm and receptive, they reveal more than they intend to, and slowly, unmistakably, a new narrative emerged. One where the house money wasn't a betrayal anymore, but a misunderstanding, where the past was something unfortunate we'd all survived together, and the future was a chance to do things right, which in her mind meant resetting the board in a way that erased the inconvenience of my boundaries. She suggested we meet for lunch, just the two of us, neutral territory, her tone warm and hopeful, and against my better judgment I agreed. Because part of growth is testing whether people can actually meet you where you are, and part of it is accepting evidence when they can't. We sat at a cafe downtown, sunlight pouring through tall windows, steam curling up from our mugs, and for a moment it almost felt normal, like a version of mother and daughter I'd always wanted but never quite had. And then she leaned in slightly and said, "I've been thinking a lot about what's fair," and I knew we were no longer talking about feelings. She talked about Meredith's progress, about how hard it was for her to rebuild, about how proud she was that Meredith was trying, and then she pivoted smoothly, almost impressively, into concerns about legacy, about how when she and my father were gone, she didn't want resentment between siblings, didn't want money to tear us apart, didn't want me to feel burdened by more responsibility than I should have. And there it was, the familiar framing, my competence recast as a liability, my stability reframed as excess. She proposed carefully that when the time came, I might consider redistributing some of what I had, not as an obligation, she stressed, but as a loving gesture, because Meredith would always need a little more support, and hadn't I always been the strong one? I didn't interrupt her, I didn't argue. I just watched her mouth move and felt a strange calm settle over me, because the fog was gone now, the pattern unmistakable, the same playbook with new packaging, and when she finished, looking at me with hopeful expectation, I realized something profound, something that marked the true end of the old version of me. I no longer felt guilty. I told her no, plainly, without apology or explanation, and the way her face changed in that instant, the flicker of irritation that slipped through the practiced serenity, confirmed everything I needed to know. She tried again, softer, invoking family unity, warning me gently about regret, about loneliness, about how life has a way of humbling even the most prepared people. And I saw clearly how fear had always been her currency, how she traded in worst-case scenarios to keep everyone orbiting her sense of control. I paid for my coffee, stood up, and told her I loved her, but that my finances and future were not up for negotiation. And I left without waiting for her response, my heart pounding, but my spine straight, because this time I wasn't escaping conflict. I was choosing myself deliberately. The fallout didn't explode immediately. It seeped, my mother's disappointment dripping into conversations with relatives, subtle comments about how money changes people, how success can make someone cold, how she worried I was closing myself off. And I watched the old machinery try to restart, watched her test whether shame would still work. And to my surprise, it didn't, because something fundamental had shifted, not in her, but in me. I started noticing how often women like me are conditioned to manage everyone else's comfort, how being reasonable becomes synonymous with being available, how boundaries are treated as betrayal when they interrupt entitlement. And that awareness made me sharper, less willing to smooth things over, more inclined to let discomfort exist without rushing to fix it. Meredith called one evening, voice hesitant, saying Mom was upset again, saying she worried our family would never be close. And instead of defending myself or justifying my choices, I asked Meredith a simple question, whether she believed I deserved to keep what was mine without being pressured to give it away. And the pause on the other end of the line was long enough to tell me everything. She eventually said yes, but her voice lacked conviction, and I realized that even now, even after everything, she was still struggling to see me as a person with equal claim rather than a resource with surplus. That realization hurt, but it didn't devastate me the way it once would have, because my sense of self was no longer tethered to their understanding. I threw myself into my own life with intention, not as distraction, but as investment, deepening friendships that were reciprocal, mentoring younger women at work who reminded me of myself at 22, earnest and eager and dangerously trusting. And I found purpose in telling them what no one had told me, that generosity without boundaries is not virtue, it's erosion. The scholarship fund awarded its first grant that summer, a young woman from a small town outside Eugene, first in her family to attend college, bright and cautious and overwhelmed. And when she wrote me a thank you letter saying the money made her feel seen, I sat in my condo and cried, because the cycle had been interrupted, because something good had grown from something painful, because my grandmother's belief had finally been honored in a way no one could distort. My father remained the wild card, sometimes supportive, sometimes evasive, torn between loyalty to my mother and a dawning recognition of how much damage his silence had done. And when he invited me to dinner alone, just the two of us, I agreed, not out of obligation but curiosity. And over pasta and cheap wine, he admitted he was scared of conflict, scared of aging, scared of losing the family he thought he was preserving by keeping the peace. And for the first time I saw him not as an accomplice, but as a man who'd traded integrity for quiet and was now paying the price. I told him gently that understanding his fear didn't undo the harm, but that accountability could still shape the future. And he nodded, eyes wet, saying he was trying, and I believed him cautiously, because trying without expectation is different from trying to earn forgiveness. As months passed, the tension ebbed and flowed, not resolving neatly but settling into something livable. And I learned that healing doesn't mean harmony. It means clarity, knowing where you stand even when others don't like it. And then, just when I thought the lesson had been fully learned, just when the ground felt stable again, an envelope arrived in the mail, my mother's handwriting unmistakable, inside a set of documents related to their will, highlighted, annotated, a cover note asking me to review them as a family. And as I scanned the pages, my stomach dropped, because there it was again, subtle but unmistakable. A proposal that rebalanced assets under the guise of fairness, that assumed my success made me flexible, that asked me to give a little so others wouldn't feel left behind. And I realized with chilling clarity that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a phase. It was a belief system, one that saw my boundaries as temporary obstacles rather than permanent lines. And in that moment, I understood the true test wasn't whether I could fight once, but whether I could hold the line repeatedly without hardening my heart or losing myself. Because some battles don't end, they evolve, and the next move would determine not just what I kept, but who I became. And as I folded the papers back into the envelope, my mind already racing, I knew the choice ahead would be quieter, but heavier than anything before, because saying no this time wouldn't just cost approval. It would redefine the entire future of my family. And the question wasn't whether I was strong enough to do it, but whether I was finally ready to accept that strength doesn't always bring reconciliation. Sometimes it just brings truth. And truth has consequences that ripple forward long after the money is settled. I sat with that envelope on my kitchen counter for 3 days without opening it again, letting it exist in my peripheral vision like a loaded weapon I refused to touch, because by then I understood something about myself that had taken 34 years to learn. My instincts were finally trustworthy. And if something made my stomach drop before I'd even read the fine print, it wasn't anxiety, it was recognition. When I finally did sit down and go through every page carefully, highlighter in hand, legal brain fully engaged, the pattern revealed itself with surgical precision. Percentages shifted just enough to look generous while still funneling security toward Meredith. Clauses framed as contingency support, language that assumed I would remain self-sufficient regardless of circumstance. And there was in black ink the quiet expectation that my strength was permanent and my needs hypothetical. It wasn't theft this time, it was preemptive justification, the kind that allows people to say later, "We didn't do anything wrong." She agreed. She didn't object. She's always been fine, and I realized with an almost academic clarity that this was never about one house, one sale, or one check. It was about a role I was expected to play forever. The reliable one, the absorber of imbalance. The person whose capacity became communal property the moment it was visible. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because I felt safe, but because the question was finally settled. There would be no negotiation, no counterproposal, no compromise disguised as maturity. And the next morning I called my parents and asked to meet, all of us, including Meredith, not a cafe or a living room or anywhere sentimental, but at my attorney's office. Neutral ground with fluorescent lighting and no room for theatrics. My mother hesitated, asked why we needed lawyers involved again, said it felt cold, transactional, and I told her calmly that what felt cold to her felt safe to me, and that alone was reason enough. When we sat down across from each other days later, the air thick with unspoken resentment and brittle politeness, I didn't ease into it, didn't soften my words, didn't frame it as a discussion. I told them plainly that I would not sign or agree to any estate plan that treated my financial independence as justification for unequal treatment, that any future distribution would need to reflect contribution, responsibility, and consent, not need, not guilt, not emotional leverage. My mother reacted exactly as she always had when control slipped, indignation first, then hurt, then accusation, saying I was being difficult, saying money had changed me, saying she didn't recognize the daughter she raised. And I watched Meredith carefully as this happened, watched her eyes dart between us, watched her shoulder slump as if she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. She said she was tired of being the reason everything felt tense, tired of being framed as fragile, tired of feeling like she was living on borrowed ground. And for the first time, truly for the first time, I saw her not as my opposite, but as another product of the same system, shaped differently but still constrained. She admitted she'd grown accustomed to rescue, that she'd learned early on that crisis brought attention and stability didn't. That part of her had resented me for not needing saving, while another part envied the freedom I seemed to have. And something in that confession loosened a knot I didn't know I was still carrying, because it meant I wasn't crazy. The imbalance had been real, visible even to the person who benefited from it. I told her then that I didn't want to be her safety net or her rival, that I wanted a sibling relationship built on honesty rather than comparison, and that meant refusing to participate in a structure that infantilized her and exploited me. My father listened, really listened, hands folded, eyes tired, and when my mother finally fell silent, he said something that surprised all of us. He said he was exhausted by the constant recalibration, by the way every decision had to orbit around one person's fragility and another's resilience, and that he didn't want to spend the rest of his life managing resentment disguised as fairness. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from all the other silences we'd endured, less charged, more resolute. And in that moment, I realized this was the real reckoning, not the frozen sale or the check or the signatures, but the collapse of a narrative that had kept everyone stuck in their assigned roles. We didn't resolve everything that day. There were tears and raised voices and moments where old habits surged forward like muscle memory. But something fundamental shifted, not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement, and that was enough to move forward without surrendering myself. I walked out of that office lighter, not because the family was healed, but because the responsibility for healing was no longer solely mine, and over the months that followed, I enforced that boundary with a consistency that would have terrified my younger self, declining conversations that circled back to obligation, redirecting guilt-laced comments with calm refusal, letting disappointment exist without rushing to soothe it. The surprising thing was how much space that created, how Meredith began making decisions without consulting anyone, how my mother's calls grew shorter and less strategic, how my father started asking questions instead of deferring, and how my own life expanded in the absence of constant emotional negotiation. I took a sabbatical from work and traveled alone for the first time, sitting in cafes in unfamiliar cities, thinking about how many women are taught that being loved means being useful, how many inherit responsibility without authority, how many are praised for endurance rather than protected from exploitation. And I wrote about it not for publication at first, just for myself, filling notebooks with observations that felt like excavations of my own past. When I returned, I was offered a leadership role I would have once hesitated to accept, worried about rocking the boat, worried about appearing greedy, and I took it without apology, recognizing that confidence and selfishness only look the same to people invested in your restraint. The scholarship fund grew quietly, donor by donor, story by story, and each recipient felt like a small corrective to the belief that sacrifice is the price of belonging. And when one young woman wrote to tell me she'd said no to supporting her family financially for the first time because she wanted to finish school, I realized the ripple was bigger than I'd imagined. My relationship with my mother settled into something restrained but civil, and I learned to grieve the mother I wanted without demonizing the one I had, understanding that accountability and compassion are not mutually exclusive, but neither can exist without boundaries. Meredith and I began meeting for walks instead of dinners, side by side rather than across from each other, talking about our lives without comparing them, and slowly, cautiously, something like mutual respect took root, fragile but real. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come and started measuring progress by behavior, by the absence of pressure, by the quiet respect of my no, and that metric served me better than any verbal promise ever had. One evening, months later, I stood in my condo looking at the framed agreement on my wall, no longer as a symbol of conflict, but as evidence of self-trust. And I thought about my grandmother, about how she'd known exactly what she was doing when she left me that money, how she'd seen something in me my parents had overlooked, not just diligence or intelligence, but the capacity to build a foundation and pass it forward. And I felt a gratitude that was steady rather than sharp. The story didn't end with everyone happy or healed or grateful. It ended with clarity, with agency, with a life no longer shaped by appeasement. And I understood then that revenge isn't about punishment or spectacle. It's about refusing to play a rigged game, about stepping out of a role that was designed to drain you, about choosing yourself so thoroughly that exploitation becomes impossible. If there's one thing I want you to carry with you from this, it's this: love that demands your self-erasure is not love. Family loyalty that requires silence in the face of harm is not loyalty. And peace that costs you your dignity is not peace at all. You are allowed to keep records, to ask questions, to say no, to walk away, to redefine fairness on your own terms. And if doing so disrupts a system that depended on your compliance, that disruption is not your failure, it's your freedom. And as I turn the lights off in my condo each night, rain tapping softly against the glass, I know with a certainty that feels earned rather than given. I didn't just protect my inheritance, I reclaimed my life. And that is a payoff no one can ever take from me, no matter how many times they try to reframe it, renegotiate it, or guilt me into giving it back.